Alright, what up? It's Gabe right here with another tier list. We're going to be going through all the commons for this next batch. We'll start with Hellhorned, my favorite clan. Just a quick note on commons and, a few mechanics that if you're newer to Monster Train you might not know. Commons, you're always guaranteed 2 copies, so 2 cards of the same card of a common from each clan that you're paired with at the start of the game. It's just included by default in your deck once you hit Covenant 1 at least. And also you'll get 1 uncommon from your primary clan, but that doesn't really apply to this particular tier list. The other important fact that you should know is that there are only 2 rings where you're offered common cards. So that's the first ring reward and the second ring reward. After that, you're never offered them again. So when you look at this pool of cards here for each of these clans, Hellhorned for example, you'll know if you're past ring 2, there is no option for you to ever find these cards. The only way you could get a common card past the first 2 rings would be if it was a consumable, and you get it from the consumable cavern event. And that, as you can see, doesn't even apply to Hellhorn, so there's literally no way to get these as cards. You can get the imps from, random imp type effects, like Imp in a Box and Imp Sickle, but, outside of that, you're not going to have them as just straight up cards. So, I figured common tier, common rarity cards would be good to go over first here. Because they are so important to the game. There's always 8 for each clan, and you can use that to kind of game plan what your odds might be for any particular card. So we'll get into it here. I'm going to do it a little bit different than I did before. Before I was kind of going down the list, starting with S. I'm just going to, in the order they are down here, we'll just sort of, do them as they come up. And I would say some of these cards are just kind of nice to have. They fill a specific role, and other ones you can basically build your run around essentially, or build at least your you can build a game plan entirely around them. I would say 3 cards particularly fit into that category of being able to build your run around them. You could maybe argue 4, definitely pre-DLC I could argue a 4th one here, but in the DLC I would say typically there are 3 of these that you can build around. And go ahead and make your guesses now which those are going to be. So we'll get right into it. And I did say I wasn't going to start sort of at the S tier and go down, but unfortunately the way this is right now lined up, we already got an S tier, the first one. That's Fledgling Imp. This is a card that was probably good pre-DLC, I just didn't use it that much for whatever reason, but it got a buff post-DLC just to the card itself, but also factoring the fact that you can self-infuse it or infuse it into other things just has made this such an insanely good card. I could make an argument that this is the single best card in the game, Fledgling Imp. I think I might say Tiresome Climb, but Fledgling Imp would be a close second for me. It was kind of funny because, there are technically times it comes up that you should pick something else over it because it just doesn't make sense for your deck, but I would say if you see this card offered in the first 2 rings, you should default to it being your choice, and you need a really strong argument, really good reason to take the others. I would say it would have to be a card that you have to build around, basically. Because, we'll get to it later, but, as good as overstacking is, I just think that a Fledgling Imp is just too good, and it just trumps the overstacking game plan tenfold. You get so much damage out of this thing. Self-infuse it, you're getting 10 rage out of it. Also, if you find Ashes of the Fallen, which isn't that unlikely, considering there's so many ways to get artifacts in the DLC, It already goes 10 by default. You could self-infuse it. It's not incorrect to do that at that point, to get 20 rage out of it per play. At that point, you don't even need Endless on it. But obviously, you want to find Endless to get the proper value out of it. The really nice thing also about taking this Rings 1 and 2 is you're often wanting to hit those early Merchant of Steels. They're the easiest ones to hit. They're also usually the correct ones to hit. And it just makes it so your options of like high rolls for the upgrades have now increased significantly. If you think about it, like typically always multi-strike is what you're going to look for at those Merchant of Steels. That's almost always going to be a really good upgrade. But you only got a 50-50 factoring and reroll, because there's 4 big upgrades: Large Stone, Multi-Strike, Endless, and Quick. Well, if you don't get Multi-Strike in the first roll, you reroll and you look for it again. You know, you can't reroll the same upgrade, so whatever you got first, if it wasn't Multi-Strike, you reroll it. You now have a 1 out of 3, so basically a 1 out of 4 into 1 out of 3 turns out to be 50% probability. Now, if you now add Endless as an additional high roll for you, it is actually really, really likely you're going to find one of the two. You know, if you're looking for Multi-Strike and Endless, the odds that you wouldn't find one of the two at a minimum is pretty low. I believe it's 1 in 6. I believe it's only a 1 in 6 that would happen. So you've now turned your high roll from a 1 out of 2 into a 5 out of 6. You now have a 5 out of 6 possibility, because the only possibility that you could possibly have as your low roll is a Quick and a Large Stone. I might be wrong on that. It might be 2 out of 6. I can't remember. So 1 out of 3. But either way, just know you're increasing your probability a pretty good amount of finding a high roll at every single future Merchant of Steel that you visit. True, if you don't find Endless, you'll have to maybe find something else. Though I do still maintain that if you did find Ashes of the Fallen, just simply a self-infuse is probably enough. You're getting 20 rage out of it. You could Hellvent it a few times, and then that's definitely enough rage to get through the run. I would also add that there's additional ways to get Endless, right? You know, if you're melting, you can just reform or find the various ways that it has, you know, Endless infusions and cards. And even within the clan itself, Transcendent does have an Endless on it. It feels bad to do that, but sometimes that's just the correct play if you couldn't find Endless. Because remember, any given run, you have a 40% chance to find any particular rare draft. You know, we're not talking about rare banners here, we're just talking about rare drafts. So you have a 40% chance to see Transcendent on any given run. That's already, you know, 40% chance that you just have an Endless opportunity there if you don't hit on your Merchant of Steels. But anyway, yeah, just the wide scaling that it provides. It also chump blocks. Very versatile, very, very OP card. Can't say enough good things about Fledgling Imp. If you're not taking it, then you're probably fucking up. Because I will say Hellhorned is my favorite clan. From what I've seen, a lot of people actually struggle with Hellhorned, and I think a big part of that is not realizing the power of Fledgling Imp and a few other cards. I think most of the other cards on this list will probably be obvious, but I think a lot of people still sleep on Fledgling Imp and how just bustedly OP it is. So next one we got here on Fortify. We got the complete opposite, in my opinion, here of value. I would say people that struggle with Hellhorned, I think, overtake Fortify. I would say, for me, it's D tier. Now it's interesting, right? Value-wise, 0 Ember for 5 armor is good value, right? But that's just, it's not really how Monster Train works. This would be, you know, in different card games this might be a good card, but in Monster Train you don't have time for these low impact, high value cards to make much of a splash, right? Like 5 armor isn't going to help you deal with waves. It's in the context of like drawing in on the first, second, or third turn. The only thing it changes in those first few waves is maybe it lets. The only thing it could ever have an impact on is if it changed a unit's ability to survive, and that they were close enough to dying that 5 HP was the difference maker. That's the typical reason I would say I don't think Fortify is really worth including in decks. Now there are certain synergies President synergy here. Give me your vote and Fortify will go up a tier, but I will say in an incant deck it's pretty okay. Granted, when I play Stygian and Hellhorned, I'd argue I typically have incant as my plan B or even plan C. As good as incant is, I think the Hellhorn lines are just typically stronger. That being said, if you do have an incant deck, Fortify fits the bill, right? It's a 0 cost. You can always play it on your floor, more or less. You should have a friendly target if you're going incant. Maybe you only have Soul Guard on the floor, but that would only apply to Ring 1. I would feel you probably have a banner guaranteed turn 1 beyond Ring 1. Anyway, it's a good incant target. So for incant, I'd give it B or C tier. And also with Apex Imp, I would give it probably A to B tier. In those cases, it's a 0 cost and flame essentially, which turns out to not even be that great. That's why I still would. There's no situation I'd ever say Fortify gets an S tier for me, even in the highest roll of synergy. I really don't think it's a very good card. It's often something I'm removing if I had to start with it, and I'm very rarely adding it to decks. I think if you find yourself taking it a lot, I'd reevaluate what it's really doing for you. Is it really helping you deal with the waves? If not, maybe there's other better options here, because there's a lot of good options at the common tier that you're probably passing up in favor of a pretty mediocre to bad card. Next card we have on this one is Hidden Passage. This one is borderline S, I would say, but I think it would be like S- to A+ tier. I'd lean toward the top of A+. I do think it's maybe, dare I say, a little overrated, because as I said, it's really cool. It's the best card, I think, for overstacking, of course. It's a 1 cost, it has no downside. You get it early on, so you know very early whether you can do overstack or not. As far as overstacking goes, I think it's the best card for sure. But dare I say, I think overstacked floors, as good as they are in a lot of combos, the fact that you are Hellhorned and Fledgling Imp exists, and just imps in general exists. It's not just Fledgling Imp. There's a lot of other imps that are just really good, right? Not being able to play imps on your floor is a huge hit to the potential just power that Hellhorn provides. So it is a catch-22. I'd say you want to go one or the other. You can, I guess, take both, and if you don't find Endless on the Imp, maybe Hidden Passage is nice to just lean into Overstack later on. That's totally doable, but I would say making the both work obviously just isn't going to work. That's just not going to work. Imps together with Hidden Passage, it's a no-no. But the reason I still rate it pretty highly, if it is overrated, it's barely overrated, because it's still a very good card. It's not just used for overstacking, right? You can use it just to displace enemies. People always use the tank as a common example, which I agree with, but I would say I use it much more often just to bring the backliners up. I think that's a much more useful use of it most of the time, because a lot of times, for whatever reason, you just don't have a good way to deal with that backliner. There are good removal options at Hellhorn, but you're just not always going to have them. And if you don't, bringing up a backliner really helps deal with that. Like, especially if it's like rings. Mid-game, you got these multi-striking Quill Hunters if you're sharded up with... I find with Hellhorn I do take early shards just because there's so many good targets, and if I have early temples, I often have to do it unless I want to wait until way late game to make my infusions. So it's useful for displacement. Also, if you find Iron Drop Cage, which is a top tier artifact in Hellhorn, it now turns into Tiresome Climb, which, as I said, is potentially the best card in the game. And as I also said, it's much easier in the DLC to find any particular artifact, because you just have Divine Hordes, so you have additional chances, and you have more gold, so you have more gold to look for them at the Merchant Trinkets. So Big ups to it for the drop cage, and also it can just be a useful way to pseudo remove things from the boss as well. You know, it's like if they have a tank in front of them or somebody behind them, you can just move it up. Can also be an okay incant card as well. It's really good in incant. Like with the incant, you want to overstack a floor, right? And then also once you overstack it, it's still like a low cost card that you can always play in your floor. So I think it's A+, just because I would say I would much prefer to find either of the rage scaling cards over this, even if I'm not doing an imp plan. I mean, it's probably no spoiler that Ritual's Battle is going to be in my S tier. It's hard to talk about this without also talking about Ritual Battle, but I think Ritual Battle is typically just going to be more useful to your plan. Like, even if you didn't have an imp floor, even if you didn't have an overstack floor, I would rather just have a single tank and a single backliner. The tank can tank, and the single backliner can just get all the Ritual Battle procs, and that's going to be more powerful typically than an overstack floor, in my opinion. Ritual Battle just provides a lot of rage, but we'll get to Ritual Battle when we get to it. So sorry for the spoilers there, but I think it's worth noting there to explain why I think there are cards I'd rather have over Hidden Passage. Not to say I don't pick it a lot though. It's I think my third or fourth most picked common in the Hellhorned pool, but definitely not on the level of Fledgling Imp and Ritual Battle. Those are like two of my most picked cards in the game, just regardless of clans. Now Hornbreak, where do you think this one falls? I never thought it was that good pre-DLC. It got a buff post-DLC. You know, it's literally doubled the damage. Double the hits doesn't really matter because it's piercing, but it's A tier for me. By the way, two of the cards on this list, I would say, fit the build-around classification. So Fledgling Imp, you can build a run around it. Hidden Passage, you can build a run around that. You know, you can build a run around overstacking. You can build a run around just having your floor-wide scaling. Now, Hornbreak is not falling under that, right? You're not going to build a run around Hornbreak. It's just a really nice, solid card to have. It costs 1 Ember. It does 10 damage by default. That will kill any backliner in the game, early game. And even mid-game. I'm trying to remember if Quill Hunters have more than 10. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. We'll just assume they don't. But only really by late game is, you know, sharded up light wings for sure, shade wings, purifiers, those will need an upgrade, but just a simple plus 10 on this does the trick. You know, that's a 25 gold upgrade. At plus 10, it's doing 30 damage. That kills any backliner in the game. It pierces through damage shield, it pierces through spell shield, of which there, you know, of spell shield in particular, there sure are a hell of a lot of spell shields in the late game in the DLC. So Hornbreak, in my opinion, has greatly shot up in the DLC and how good it is. And also remember, it's very useful for sacrificing your own imps. If you have an endless imp, sometimes it's just hard to have them die because you probably want to make your units quick if you can a lot of the time. That'll especially make it hard to use it as a chump blocker outside of like the final battle. You know, Divinity, it's pretty easy to just have it die, but it's nice to have something like Hornbreak. Not only is it useful for sacrificing imps, but it's useful if your imps, for whatever reason, have extra health. You know, that happens sometimes. Maybe you took an artifact early before you had an imp that just gave like 5 health or something. Now your torches don't sacrifice it. If you have like a Vine Grasp, it doesn't sacrifice it, but Hornbreak will always sacrifice it, even unupgraded. You could add 25 health to it if that made sense to do, and then plus 10 still sacrifices it. So it's really useful for sacrificing imps, but then of course it just kills any backliner in the game. If you add enough damage to it, like it's not a horrible plus 30 target. You know, at plus 30 it's killing a lot of tanks even. Early game tanks, but also mid game tanks. It won't kill the sharded up ones, but it'll still kill, you know, the shield dudes and whatnot. So I really like Hornbreak. Now next one on this list is Molting Imp. This was a tough one for me to evaluate, honestly. I'm putting it in C tier, simply based when I look at my pick rate, it really just isn't that high. It's honestly not that much higher than Fortify, but I do think it's a better card, like to a significant level comparing it to Fortify. I just, for whatever reason, I think there's so many other valuable Hellhorned commons that Molting Imp just doesn't make the cut a lot of the time. But in a vacuum, I think Molting Imp is a good card. 5 damage is usually enough to kill most the early game. Granted, so it'll still kill up, a sharded up backliner. It's not going to take care of armor trials. It's not going to take care of Talos the Pusher armor dudes. But it is worth noting. I think I often take it with plans to just use it as an infusion. Like we talked about Ashes of the Fallen earlier. So often if you have Ashes of the Fallen, you really don't need to self-infuse Fledgling Imp. Like I said, you could. It wouldn't be necessarily incorrect to just get 20. But if I already know I, for instance, had found an Endless on this Fledgling Imp, it is perfectly fine to put a Molting Imp infusion into it. Remember, it gives 15 damage instead of 5 damage with the Essence. So that would be, in the case of Ashes of the Fallen, doing 30 damage. As we said, 30 is that sweet spot. 30 will kill anything in the game. So if you had an Endless Fledgling already giving you 10 with Ashes of the Fallen, you might as well put something like a Molten Imp might be the ideal sort of essence in the cases of an early Ashes of the Fallen, because it happens, somewhat more often than you'd think that you find in early Ashes, and you're probably taking it if you see it and you have an Imp or something. Even if you don't have an Imp, I would often take it if I found it early game, just speculatively. It's just too powerful. But for the record, I think as a vanilla unit, 5 damage, it falls off pretty quick. You're almost always going to have to infuse it, whether it's infusing it onto itself or into something else. I find it's typically you'd want to put it into something else, because 20 damage isn't really that significant of a breakpoint. There's not much in the game that has 20 versus 15 health, right? There's a lot of stuff that has 15 health. I think, I'm trying to think, is Lightwing the top? Like I think Lightwing is 15. It might be 20, but I believe it's 15. But like Shade Wings, for example, can be at 25 or 30, and then Purifiers are at 30, and Shade Wings are at 25. So going from 5 to 20, you'd almost rather always put this into a different Imp, because 15 is basically the breakpoint. 15, or in the case of Ash of the Fallen, 30. But 20 and 40, there's no difference there. So I think as a unit, I usually am not really using Molting Imp. But I do think the Essence is pretty decent, and early game it can serve an okay. It's pretty good as a unit early game, honestly. Like it just completely counters any sort of clergyman bosses that have backliners. It'll take all of them out. So I don't know. It feels weird to put it in C tier, but I think you could argue B tier for it. But looking at my pick rate, I can't really justify B tier compared to the other stuff I'm about to rate. So that's Molting Imp. And now we got Ritual of Battle. Pretty damn good card. I would generally prefer Fledgling Imp, but there are cases where I would take Ritual over Fledgling. If I know I'm not hitting up a lot of Merchant of Steels, for example, and I already have a setup that can just win probably with Ritual of Battle, I may as well go Ritual of Battle. Like if my map looks like it really leans toward Merchant of Magics, might as well just go the Ritual of Battle. For 110 gold, you're guaranteed to get it down to a 1 cost. You can dedicate some future Hellvents to it. It's pretty hard to lose a run if you just have some generic good tank and any of the good backliners. A Rail Beater with a Horn Warrior infusion, or just a Horn Warrior in general, or something from the other clans, Sweepers, Animus of Will, stuff like that. Pretty hard to lose with a few Ritual of Battles and just a good tank, some form of defense. You got Dazed, you got Armor, whatever, to keep the backliner alive from the sweep. Or you could just set up mid, that's always possible too. But 10 rage, that's 20 damage scaling minimum. There's stuff like Deranged Brute, there's stuff like Resonant Shard that makes that even better. But even at the base, just 20 damage of scaling for 1 Ember. That's the big thing I would say with Ritual Battle. If you don't know, not really worth it at 3 Ember, so I highly recommend just getting it down to 1 Ember. I also don't really recommend double stacking it. I think it's much it's too hard because I typically don't want to take an Ember upgrade, right? I typically want to take draw, or in some cases pip. With Ritual, I'd have to imagine I'm probably just wanting draw though, because I'm assuming I'm not going imps if I'm going Ritual battle. So with Ritual, I want draw upgrades, so I don't want to have a situation where I have to Ember Drain turn 1 and draw into a 3-cost Ritual battle turn 2, or even a 2-cost in a lot of cases. It's just too awkward. It's like I need to play a unit a lot of the times turn 2, but if I have to let Ritual cycle without playing it, that is a brutal hit to what your deck game plan is. So I think the most consistent thing to do, just get it down to 1 cost, and you can always play it when it comes up in most situations. And you play that a few times, it's really hard to lose. It's really, really hard to lose. You'll deal with waves, you'll be scaled up for the boss. What more could you want, right? It just solves the problem of scaling so well and so consistently. I will say it is worth double stacking though if I can get a -2 temple upgrade on it. You know, then I can justify it being double stacked at a 2 cost. 2 costs for 20 rage is pretty worth, but I definitely don't like it at 3 costs for 20 rage. Much rather prefer it as 1 cost for 10 rage. And that's pretty much Ritual Battle. Just really, really solid card. One of my most taken cards in the game. Fledgling Imp has still taken more, but there's a significant gap between the S tier and the A tier in my pick rates here. The next card. Oh, and by the way, Ritual was kind of the third card that I say I would build around. You know, you can build around Ritual in the sense that you're building around this card knowing it's your offensive scaling game plan. Now the next one we got here is Vent. I'm putting it in A tier. I debated B tier, but I think it's a pretty good card. I do think generally I like Hornbreak more. You know, flat EoE, in the context of what it does, it's pretty good, don't get me wrong, but in a lot of fights, a single target removal accomplishes the same thing you'd be looking from Vent. Especially like, there's a certain thing when I evaluate common tier, you kind of have to take early game into a little bit of extra account too. Like there's not, outside of clergymen and whatnot, there's only a few fights where you have like double crossbowman in the back, right? A lot of times it's just like a single crossbowman, or a crossbowman and like a healer. You don't really care that much about the healer, so you know, being able to just have a card that pierces and does way more damage than Vent by default, I think is more useful. It also has that additional benefit of being able to self-sacrifice your imps, but it's not enough for me to like knock it down a tier below Hornbreak. You know, if you look at my pick rates, they're pretty similar between Hornbreak and Vent. Hornbreak's a little bit more. But Vent, you know, there are enough fights still where there are, you know, clergymen or double attacking backliners, especially come mid to late game, right? And then Vent, if you weren't aware, it's a weird card because as an X cost, it's pretty useless, right? Like it doesn't do hardly any damage per ember spent. The main thing about this card is that you add flat damage to it. Now in the DLC, I would argue you really want to put a temple upgrade into it. The most ideal one to me would be the piercing upgrade, and then if you can find an additional just plus 10, that's fine. The plus 30 is fine as well. I'd much prefer the piercing though. It costs less shards and it just does more. As I said, there's so much spell shield later on in the game that 30 damage on event often isn't relevant because there's so many enemies with spell shield. You know, I'd almost say that the plus 30 is more in line with just a regular 25 gold plus 10 essentially. But long story short, you want to put some plus damage on it. Surge Stone can work too if you're not like super needing to recycle into it. If you just need like a one-time AoE blast, it's fine for that. It is weird though. It's like a weird design decision, I guess, to have it be to have the X costs function this way. Where it's like a lot of X costs are essentially not really X costs. They're just like hold it in your hand, play out everything else that costs Ember, and then at the end of your turn, just play your X cost that has a flat damage increase for 0, and let it go to town. That's basically what these type of X costs represent. But you know, for the record, weird design aside, Vent is a very good card. It's very good AoE, very solid. And the next one, was tough to evaluate. I think a lot of people probably evaluate it higher than I do. Certainly pre-DLC, I would probably put this S tier, but and this is also the this Welder Helper card. It's B tier, by the way, I think. But I think I could argue S or A tier pre-DLC. Post-DLC, I don't think it's as useful. It was especially useful as just a god tier Shardtail Queen card pre-DLC. I still think it's at its best with Shardtail Queen, even post-DLC, but Shardtail Queen can't really solo the game like she could pre-DLC. Like, I could just go rally an Imperialist and have an endless Welder Helper and Hellvent that thing a few times, and that was usually enough to beat the game. You know, that would clear most waves. It would do enough damage to at least a single tank. If I could find a one-horn tome, I'd have enough energy or armor for days that I could play it. If not, you could probably just leak a few of the second tanks. They're already damaged a lot from Imperialist, and then you're definitely good for Relentless. But post-DLC, there's just too much. You know, that plan's not going to work for you as much. It'll still be an okay plan to have Shardtail get you some value, but you're going to need a lot of other stuff. I would much rather have Fledgling Imp than Welder Helper. I would rarely ever take a Welder Helper over Fledgling Imp. Even with Shardtail, I would definitely take Fledgling Imp over it. I also think that the Essence is pretty overrated with Welder Helper. Often if you're running Imps, wanting to play them every turn, you're wanting to sacrifice them. If you use the Welder Helper infusion, you have to have Imperialist, or you have to have something like a consistent Hornbreak or an important work or some good Imp sacrifice card, because now a lot of the targeted removal in the game, like torches, Vinegrass and whatnot, are not going to be able to remove your unit. So I don't know. I think it is overtaken a bit. I do find, I'll watch people play that aren't necessarily, like, they don't really like Hellhorned, and I can tell why. It's like I'll see him often like take a Welder Helper over, say, a Ritual Battle or Fledgling Imp. There's probably some situations facetiously where that is correct, but I would say in a general sense, 95% of the time that is wrong. You just, what you get out of a Ritual, what you get out of a Fledgling is so much more in the DLC, at least in the game plan of what you need to win the DLC. I really think that you get so much more out of these Rage cards than you do out of an Armor card. Now, obviously, there's things that can change that. You know, like if you have an Apex Imp, for example, Welder Helper would be much more preferable. Sometimes even not, though. Sometimes you're overstacking your Apex Imps and you just don't have room on the floor. Like if your Apex Imps have Steelwork or Infusion, you would just want to overstack as many of them as possible. And so it's not, even then, it's not always like preferable. But all that being said, I still think it's a pretty decent card. Like, I'm not sad to have a Welder Helper in my deck. Certainly early game, it's very powerful. That will guarantee the survivability of whatever your frontliner is, and it'll pretty much guarantee Relentless. You know, it's pretty hard to lose when you have 25 health on your frontliner. The only way I guess you lose is if you just have really no damage. Like if it's like Train Steward level damage that your floor is providing, maybe you lose still, but as long as you have any sort of decent damage dealer, if you get just a Welder Helper or 2 in, there's no way you're losing early game. But I do think it falls off a bit late game. If it's often something that by mid to late game I'm removing from my deck because it just doesn't really do anything for my deck anymore. So I do think it's fallen off a bit in the DLC, and I think if you're struggling with Hellhorn, it could be a culprit of something you may want to consider taking less. Certainly if you see what I've listed in the S and A tier alongside it, maybe you just give these a shot and see how they do for you, right? Maybe it changes your success rate with Hellhorned here. So that's pretty much what I feel about the common tier here. Curious to see what y'all thoughts are about it. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. We'll do Awoken next.